Welcome and thank you for joining me here today as I talk about advanced animation techniques inside Unreal Engine. My name is John Fielding and I'm a lead animator here at Epic Games. I've had a bit of a windy path getting into Epic, but along the way I've had experiences with different softwares, technical needs, and tight deadlines that have all accumulated and brought me here today to show you some of the tips and tricks I've learned to harness the power of animating in Unreal. Quick bio on me. My first industry job was doing rotoscoping and match move for 3D conversion. Then the Third Floor Inc. took a chance on me, and I went on to do previs and postvis with them for about 3.5 years. I eventually left there to pursue full-on animation, where I found a really great cycle of work between studios like Psyop, Blur, Frame Machine, and The Mill, where I did some advertising work, but mostly ended up doing video game trailers and cinematics. I'd always wanted to get a job in actual gameplay animation, and in fact, video games are the reason why I went to school for CG animation to begin with. I thought I'd do well, but I was stuck in that catch-22 of you need to have the experience to get the job, but you need the job to get the experience. So when the opportunity came up to not only work at Epic, but work at Epic on a new game, animating in a new software, I knew I had to get this job. I've always approached animation from a bit of a technical point of view, using constraints and scripts and a philosophy to let the computer do the computery stuff. Over the course of my career, I've had and taken the opportunity to dabble in a lot of different softwares, which has led to a lot of cross-pollination of ideas on how to work efficiently and how each software works similarly and differently, and to embrace those differences. It all really clicked together when I came here, and I not only get to work on the new Lego Fortnite game, but I get to do so alongside some really amazing folks working hard every day to build the animation tools and make Animating Engine really great. So I'd like to give a huge shout out to that development team here at Epic, working behind the scenes, and also sometimes in front of you here at things like Unreal Fest. We're so lucky to have these guys here with us as we stress test the tools in a live production environment with real deadlines. They jump right in when something breaks catastrophically and really listen to feedback on what's important to us day to day. I can't thank them enough for dealing with me constantly pinging them with ideas or bugs and tickets upon tickets. So what am I actually going to be talking about today? So I'm going to quickly go over some of the common gotchas that I see, and then give a bit of a deep dive into how things work differently in Unreal, and then show off some really cool, easy tricks that can improve your workflow. Hint, it's mostly space switching and constraints. The first thing that I've seen trip people up is understanding what layer bars and key bars are. It sounds pretty silly, but it's actually rather helpful to learn the ins and outs of these. You can find the options for them inside the little eyeball in the sequencer. So layer bars, they're that gray bar at the top of your asset. It's essentially showing you the range between the left and rightmost key on your asset. Then it lets you move and scale those keys globally. So the pro is that you can easily move all your animation around in time just by clicking and dragging on that bar. But the con is also that you can easily accidentally drag all of your animation around by clicking on the bar. The other pro is that you can click and drag on the ends and you can scale it to a specific start and end frame. But then, as you might guess, the con is you can also accidentally start scaling all your keys around. For that reason, I unchecked that one. And key bars are that little line between each of the keys. So if you click on it and drag, it's going to move the two adjacent keys. If you select multiple keys, you can either click on one of the keys or the bar in between, and you'll move all those keys, which means you don't have to be as precise when clicking and moving keys to time. But it can also become an accident if you go to do a drag select and you drag select too close to the middle, it's going to start moving your keys on accident. So I also turn those off. The next thing that takes a bit of getting used to is that selecting a track in the sequencer is actually selecting all of the animation data inside that track. So you can see in the video here, whenever I click on a track, my curve editor gets filled up with all the animation inside that track. When I expand that track out and I pick a channel underneath, like one of the specific controllers, it'll show me just the contents of that controller. So like here, I'm selecting the global, there's nothing there. This controller has some keys on it, showing me those keys. This gets granular down to expanding out to the individual channels like location X. And if you're working on a version before 5.5, there's a common stumbling block to be aware of, where if you click on a track and then select the controller in your viewport, that track remains selected. So your curve editor is going to remain a giant pile of spaghetti, and it won't feel like it's showing you the curves based on your controller selection, but that's just because the track is still selected, showing you all that data, and your controller probably is also inside of that giant pile. So if you run into that, just know, hit escape in the sequencer to drop your selection there. And your curve editor will start to function like you're used to and expect. This behavior of accessing all of your animation data is actually a really cool strength of Unreal to get your head around. Because you don't have to select a single controller to add, delete, or move keys around. It takes a bit of explaining, but the same way how I just showed you how selecting a track will fill your curve editor with the animation data inside that track, the same concepts work for adding, deleting, or moving keys on a track. So you can see that you can click on that little add key button, and it's going to key everything under that track that you just selected. So I just set a key on every controller on my rig just by clicking on that. So if I expand out that track and then I click on one of the controls, I'm going to key all the attributes inside that control. And then I can expand that and just key specifically an individual channel. But then when I collapse it all back up, just to one track in a second. There we go. Now that track is showing me there's a key somewhere on some controller, and I can move those keys around and know that I'm moving every key on every controller. I'm deleting keys, all that kind of fun stuff. This does have a big caveat, though, that if you're using the filters in the sequencer, some of those, like the selected controller control filter, is going to be showing you just the keys on those selected controls because it fundamentally is changing what the sequencer is showing you. So even if you collapse the control rig track up to that base track, if you're using one of these filters, you won't be seeing all of the keys on your rig again. So it's because of that I actually personally work without any filters on, and my control rig track always collapsed. So that at any time I can quickly and easily set keys, add keys, remove keys, retime all my stuff with a lot of ease. A quick tip is to link your curve editor time range. By default, you can be panning a different range in your sequencer versus your curve editor, and that's super disorienting. So I recommend going under the play gear and turning on this little checkbox. Then, whenever you pan in one or zoom in one, it's going to match them. And here, I'm super OCD, and I make sure that like they're exactly the same width and size and all this kind of stuff, so that it looks like one continuous playhead across them. But I really encourage everyone to explore whatever layout of all these windows works best for you. And speaking of that, I want to preach the importance of setting preferences and not living with the defaults. They do a good job trying to prep you with some basic defaults, but you have to remember that Unreal isn't an animation-first program. So you should really take the time to go through all the settings and dial things to work best for you. Set hotkeys, move the layout around, all that stuff. And it can feel pretty sketchy not having a nice little key map like Maya has, but every section of Unreal has its own set of hotkeys, so you're generally pretty safe. And also everything that's hotkeyable has 2 slots for hotkeys. So if you want, you can leave the default hotkeys and also add your own in a second column. And I know a lot of people avoid doing this, even on other DCCs, because they don't want to or they don't know how to grab all their prefs and port them around with them from project to project. You can find these preferences in your local engine saved config directory. And depending on your project, there may be a couple of these like saved config folders with similar Windows editor folders and content. My pro tip is that when you found these, make a backup folder on your desktop and mirror that folder structure and drop those files in there. Then when you go to a new project, you can just like copy paste those top 2 folders and everything merges into place and you're up and running without missing a beat. So the deep dive I'm going to try to get into is about our 3 ways to connect things in your level sequence. Those being the attached tracks, constraints, and spaces. And they may all feel familiar to you coming from something like Maya, but at the same time, it might be kind of hard to distinguish between why and when you'd use each one specifically. So I'm here to hopefully fix that. The biggest difference between all of these and what you're probably used to is that you can actually animate without needing any extra offset groups, whether you're using the attached track, the constraint, or a space. And that's because what they're doing isn't locking your data, but instead just putting your data in a new space. And most of them will do an automatic curve compensation for you. So let's start with the attached tracks. You add those via the plus sign on your asset. And as such, they only work on the asset level of things. Meaning you can't put an attached track on just one controller of your rig. It's the whole thing or nothing. The default attach option is to do no preservation of your poses, and it's actually the only one of the three here that has an option to not auto-convert your keys. And that does mean that if you're not careful, it can just send your attached object flying out into space once you add it. So when would you use these? Well, they're useful if you have a prop or something that you just want to attach and you're not going to be picking up and setting it down a lot. You just want to connect it and just move on with your life. But for gameplay, it's actually really handy if you're doing some sort of a prop animation that's going to have its own animation exported. In game, it'll likely be attached via a socket onto your character that's doing its own animations. It can be maybe a bit of a confusing math situation, but essentially, because the attach track is grabbing the whole asset, the exported animation sequence for that prop is going to be it sitting at the origin doing whatever animation that you did local, which makes it super easy to just attach in engine and have it play as you expect. If you instead did a parent constraint, that's going to end up exporting out all of the world space motion, and you'd have to do some other stuff to lock it back down in place to be used in engine. The next level deeper is spaces. You can find them in the animation panel where they have their own little section, and you can also space switch anything by just selecting a controller and hitting tab in the viewport. Spaces only work within your rig, meaning you can't put a controller into the space of another rig. Every controller by default has two spaces, parent and world. Parent space is just the rig default behavior. World space is the true world. It's akin to taking the controller and removing it from the rig altogether. These can be a bit tricky to understand, but it's more like if you're able to non-destructively reparent controllers inside of your rig. Your riggers can add spaces that will come with your rig, or you can make any you want on the fly by just hitting that plus sign. You'll get the hierarchy of your rig. You can pick whatever you want. It'll add it to the list. You can't actually reverse the hierarchy too much though. So you can't like make the shoulder a child of the hand, but you can make that hand a child of the other hand, the head, the torso, the hip, whatever. And it will just compensate all of your keys to that new space from the current time frame that you're on to the end. So if you do this on the first frame, it's going to set that space just infinitely. If you do it mid-shot, you'll see these little colored bars show up that show you like what space it is where. And that's where we have to take our first little tangent and talk about our friend the compensation key. Whenever you do a space switch or a constraint, our system is doing a perfect handoff from one to the next, meaning you don't ever have to worry about a constraint pop. And if you do end up with one, we actually have a button that just fixes it. The way that this magic trick works is that it goes back to 0.99999 on the frame before, and it just stamps a key to preserve that curve in the subframes leading up to that whole frame. Then it compensates the pose value on the current whole frame to remain in the same position, but just in the new space. And then it'll proceed to update all the values on your keys after that in time to the new space. This can make copying poses on that space switch frame or constraint frame a little tricky because you're probably going to end up selecting that subframe key on accident. Thankfully, the old trick of just going to the frame you want to copy, select the controls, middle mouse in the timeline, and then hit enter to set a key will copy that pose and not the subframe stuff. The other annoying part is when you have these keys, if you're stepping backwards by keyframes with hotkeys, you're likely going to end up on that subframe. So you have to be mindful when stepping back and don't spend time posing on that subframe accidentally. Because if you go back to the whole frame and you set a key, that automatic compensation is going to update and just trash whatever you had done on that subframe. We have discussions on how to fix this and make this less of a stumbling block in the future, but for now, it's really good to just be aware of what's going on. So hopefully it makes more sense and you won't get tripped up by it and just avoid using it altogether. Constraints can be found in the same animation panel right below the spaces section. They're actually a lot like spaces, but where spaces are moving the whole controller around in hierarchy, constraints are like rewiring specific channels. Your keys are still going to be compensated from your current frame to the end, just like with spaces, and they're going to result in that compensation key. Unlike spaces, constraints can work across rigs to connect things. They come in the typical flavors of translation, rotation, scale, parent. And then we also have the look at option as well, which in Maya is called an aim constraint. Each of these has extra options hidden inside those three dots, so explore it. They allow you to constrain with or without offset, pick and choose which axis that you do or don't want constrained, Really nice stuff in this latest edition. One thing that trips people up is that because it's compensating your keys so that you can still animate, there is no concept of a constraint weight. It's just on or off. And that can stress you out coming from Maya. I know, it stressed me out. So in Maya, you can do a constraint weight because they're locking you from being able to animate it while it's constrained. So there's actually still the base of animation for it to blend back to. But we don't do that. And it took me a while to get used to, but because I know that there are some clever tricks you can do with constraint weights. But not having to deal with swapping from animating on a controller to a locator and then back to the controller is actually well worth not being able to do a little funky constraint weight trick. And the other thing that can trip people up is that when you have multiple constraints in a scene, the selected dropdown is on by default, and it's just going to show you the constraints on your currently selected objects. And that can be changed to view all the constraints in your level sequence or all, which could include constraints that are coming from your level that your level sequence opened in. So if I switch it to level sequence, I'll get a quick view of every constraint in my scene. And more importantly, if something's jittering in playback or looks broken, I can go here to try to resort the evaluation of these constraints, which is often necessary if you have this many constraints. You need to tell Unreal like the proper order of operations. So that was maybe a bit of an overload, but here's the part where we finally get to put all that to use using this cute dragon rig from Chase Cooper. I'll be showing you how you can go from this simple wing flap animation to a full body animation using just space and constraint tricks and just a couple of keys by hand. This is less to demonstrate how you should animate things, but to show the power of what you can do with ease in Unreal. You can do all this stuff in Maya, but it's going to take a lot more steps, third-party tools, or scripts, and time. So how did I do that? Well, the first thing you need to do is a little bit of setup. And depending on what you have in your rig, this might just be flipping some switches and dialing some settings. In my case, it meant setting up one important constraint. So here I have that base animation, which is a basic little wing flap. The first thing I want to do is to give this guy a nicer starting pose. But you'll see that once I start to rotate the body, the wing flap is no longer nice and level. That's because those wings are children of the body controller. What I want to do is split out the rotations and make the rotations stay in world space while the translations stay with their parent. To do that, I'm going to grab the base controller of each wing and do a rotation constraint. And I'm going to point that at the global controller. You notice that when I do that, my existing curves updated and they're all in that new rotation space. So it's automatically compensating all the keys to the new setup, and now I can rotate the body and the wings keep that angle. So that gives me a lot of power and flexibility to be able to pose however I want and be sure that I'm not altering that original wing flap angle. And you'll notice that as I build my pose, I use a lot of indirect manipulation. Maya has this too, but sorta, and it only works really well on translate and scale. In Unreal, it's as easy as holding down Control and using left, middle, and right mouse for X, Y, and Z, and that works on every controller. I'm also pretty particular about how I design my pose, so you'll see me doing some weird stuff here. I'm actually moving the offset controller up and then counter moving the body down so that I can use that offset controller to give myself a new pivot point. And that new pivot point will let me rotate the whole body from where the wings would be holding this weight up. Now that I have that set up, I'll go ahead and fast forward through me posing out the rest of this dragon. What's great is that at this point I have the confidence to do whatever I want and not really worry about messing up that original wing flap. And with the indirect manipulation, I can just quickly pose things out without ever having to click on any of those little tiny axes. Super fast. So now I've got the pose, but I don't have any animation. So first I have to take a bit of a detour and talk about our first caveat, which is that there are two things to keep in mind when making constraints. If you have any user tangent angles, like not using auto tangent, your tangents might be wonky when they go into the new space. And secondly, in order to make that flawless handoff, there's that constraint space, that subframe key that I was talking about before. Since I'm going to be working on a cycle and I want to be able to easily copy and paste and cycle curves, I'm going to need to fix my tangents, then I'm going to need to zoom way in and delete that extra little double key. So here I'm doing it again, just going to be lazy, throw an auto key, or auto tangent, easy, and then just zoom in and nuke that little subframe key. I did this on all the controls, or on all the channels, but I'm just abbreviating for you. So my first real step is going to be the age-old trick of copying the rotation of the wing into the translation up and down of the dragon. So I need to identify which curve is the main up and down of the wing. Rotation Y seems to be that one. So I'm going to copy that into the location Z of the offset controller. Side note, a little pro tip that I do is I actually docked this new anim details panel next to my curve editor. And I collapsed that little outliner thing in the curve editor, and now it feels and acts a lot more like how I would work in Maya, using the anim details panel to quickly filter my desired curves. Now this might not be obvious because by default the anim details panel has each of those sections collapsed, but once you expand them out, you can click on a track and it's going to just filter every controller you have to that channel, which is pretty freaking huge. The next step is to then offset this curve to work with the motion of the wing more logically. To do that, we need to cycle our curve, which unfortunately right now is a bunch of clicks, but in the future, we're going to get this process simplified. I'm going to speed through me noodling the offset timing here. And then I'm going to also want to pivot the scale of this up and down because that curve is just way too much for this range of motion. The multi-select tool is actually pretty handy for doing a quick little scale, and it has some nice options to scale based on first, last, average, or bounding center per curve. A word of caution, as you see here, is that our scale tools also don't currently scale the tangents, so be aware of that if you don't have auto tangents, which will happen when you're copy-pasting curves. But what I really love about animating in Unreal is that I can have my animation playing while I'm doing all of this offsetting and scaling. When doing that in Maya, anytime you touch a curve, it actually pauses your playback. But in Unreal, I can just focus on my animation as I slide the scale up and down. I'm going to speed through some more noodling. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, cool, but there's nothing new here. But here's actually where all the Unreal tricks and space switching magic kick into gear. So the concepts of space switching and moving your animation data around aren't novel on their own, but doing this stuff in Unreal is so simple and easy and can really transform your workflow's productivity and confidence once you can harness them correctly. So let's start by loosening up the legs a little bit. To do that, we'll use the default spaces that come with every controller in Unreal. The parent space and world space. I'll select the legs, and you'll see that there's just that first key on them. And in order to do this trick, I actually need keys on it for the whole timeline. Otherwise, when I swap to the world space, those legs are just going to be pinned in space. And that's not what I want. I want that whole motion of him going up and down pushed into world space. So I'm going to pop it back into parent space real quick. And there are a few ways to do this. The first way I'm going to show you is how to do it if you don't want baked out data. You can actually use the snapper tool to sample the key timing from one controller to another. And the snapper tool is in the anim toolbox right up there. I'm going to load up those IK controllers into the child slot, and I'm going to take the offset controller and throw it in the parent slot. I'm going to make sure snap position and rotation is on and also keep offset. The default mode is to do keys only, so I'm just going to hit snap animation now. And because that offset controller was offset in a time range outside of what I just told it to do, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to give me some decent timings to start with, and I just need to add an extra key at the end for the loop. The point here is just to get me some data to work with. The curves here are flat right now, which might feel kind of pointless and confusing, but once I swap this into world space, you'll see all the awesome curve compensation kicks in, and we have all these fun little curves to play with now. And this is pulled that out of the rig, and now this is showing me how that was moving in world space. So now I just need to click, 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 cycle the curves, and I'll start with one leg, and I'll just offset the timing a little bit there, and then I'm going to offset the other one so that they're both offset, but offset a little different from each other. And then I might start tweaking on the curve here a little bit if I want, just to kind of make sure they're not quite as twinned. But now that I'm looking at this, I've only offset in time, but not value. So the legs are actually moving quite a bit relative to the body now that they're out of sync. And if I just scale these curves down, it's scaling them down in world, which again is just going to pin them in space. And it's not toning it down how much they're moving relative to the body. So the solution is actually to move it back into parent space now. Which is easy to go into the first frame, hitting tab in the viewport, boom, now they're back in parent space. And those curves that before were all flat and boring have been moved to world space, offset in time, and brought back into parent space. And now this curve is that motion relative to the body. And when doing this on cycled and offset curves, that you'll see I occasionally have errant keys outside my frame range after swapping spaces. So I just have to be mindful and clear those keys when that happens. And now I can play with this curve and easily clean up and tone down how much bounces in the legs relative to the body. Do some basic cleanup. I could probably just have deleted all these keys and made this a lot easier. But I like to touch it all. Boop, boop, boop. And then I'm going to repeat this process on the other leg. And this is going to give me some nice offsets in the leg that are driven based on the timing of the body, which is based on the timing of the wing flaps. And I've achieved all this with very little stress. The process is going to end up with having keys everywhere, but with what we're doing, you also have sliders and animation layers and stuff, and it makes it easy to manage dense keys. And I'm not a huge fan of how straight up and down these legs are. Had I originally put some offset control in addition, or some rotations into that offset control in addition to the translate, I would have more motion on these legs and I could have offset the X and Y location channels. It's fine, I'm just gonna blow away keys and make a simple sine curve, play with it real quick, and then do that on the other leg. And then now I have some nice loose legs hanging underneath my little dragon. But the feet are still pretty stiff. But great if we get a bit of rotation on them too. How are we gonna do that? Well, that's where the next trick comes into play. Look at constraints. It's often referred to as putting something into aim space, and learning this technique can really unlock some great workflows. I use it a lot for cleanup, but I'll also use it in blocking because it gives a really novel way to control the angle of something separate from the translation of it. Think being able to clean up the tip of a sword while simultaneously being able to polish the arm and the body without really losing much of the arc on that tip of the sword. At its core, setting something into aim space is converting the rotation values into translation values. And those translation values themselves can actually be put into whatever space you want, which is extra layers of craziness. But we'll start with the simple and most common scenario, which is just pushing rotations into world space translations. But like, what does that mean? Well, let's jump back in. So we're back with a little dragon, and we have our foot moving up and down nicely, but with like that little bit of side to side we added. This trick starts by extrapolating out that translation to an offset in space. To do that, we don't really have any nulls or locator types, but the simple cube works pretty well. And as a little side tangent, I always drag directly from my add menu into my sequencer, because that does two important things for me. First, it's automatically going to make it spawnable, which means that that cube now lives in my level sequence and not the level. So if I close and reopen Unreal, or open my level sequence in a different level, it's still going to be there. The other thing it does is it also puts it at the origin, which I like because most of the time I like to start from 0 and not some random spot I just dragged it into. And the cube is usually too big, so the first thing is just to scale it down. From there, I'm going to use the snapper to align it to that object that I'm going to put into aim space. So I put the cube in as a child, load up the controller as the parent, make sure snap position and rotation's on. I run this first with no offset to pick up the exact location and orientation of my controller. I also set it from keys only to all frames, and then I run the snap. And then now I can pull it cleanly on one axis to establish that offset that I want. And then I turn keep offset back on, and I re-snap. It's a few steps, but it's pretty nice and easy and doesn't involve any actual constraints. It takes some playing around with this trick and doing this a few times, but you'll start to get a sense for just how far out you want to move it. The further away you move it, the less dramatic effect that value and time offsets have on those rotations. It's kind of like parallax, if that makes sense. Now I'll add the look at constraint by selecting the controller, clicking the plus sign to add constraint, pick look at, then I'm going to eyedropper this cube. And now you can see this cube is driving the rotation of the foot. But if I were to hit play, nothing will have changed visually because I haven't done any offsetting, and that cube is just extrapolated from the leg 1 to 1. So another click, click, click to get the curve cycling on this box, and I can start playing with things. So by delaying this up and down curve, I'm actually effectively causing the foot rotations to drag because they're following the location of this box. If I like how much is delayed in time, but I wish the foot moved more, I can just amplify this curve to embellish that. Then I'm going to do the same to the side and continue playing until I'm happy with the result. Cycle pre, cycle post. But I offset in time, and I play with some scale, and you can see how floppy I can make this foot just by scaling these curves. Super easily, I have total control over how much I want, how little I want, And now it's all nice and loose. At that point, I'll bake down my constraint by right-clicking on the animation window and hitting bake. A lot of people are avoidant of this type of workflow because, yes, it means baked keys. But again, sliders, layers, bake filter that can reduce your keys, it's pretty easy to work with and clean up later. And after it's baked, there are, again, those errant keys. I have to go delete those, keep my cycles nice and clean. And then when that's done, I also make sure that I delete that now inactive constraint, because that can actually cause some problems later. The cube no longer has effect on the foot, and we have all this nice free overlap that's generated based on the movement of the foot, which is based on the movement of the body, which is based on the rotation of the wing. I think it's pretty cool, and I didn't have to invent any animation. I'll speed through me repeating this process on the other leg. I like to do things separately so that I'm making independent choices on the limbs, which helps keep things from being like perfectly twinned. And then here you can see the result of that. I've got some nice loose legs on the feet of my little dragon friend. So what's next? Well, the rest of the body. And we're going to use a combination of these tricks to wrap this up. So I'll start by using the aim constraint on the upper arm to get that moving. Once that's done, I'll be able to take the lower arm in hand and just use normal world space switches to offset the rotation values, because then they'll have rotations on them to be able to offset. That's possibly a big load of nonsense to you, but don't worry, I'll step you through the process as I do it. The first step is going to be to run the aim space trick on the upper arm to convert the translations into rotations. I already have my cube, so I'll run the snapper. I'll turn keep offset off, snap position, rotation on, load up the upper arm, and snap. Since the cube already had keys on every frame, the keys only or all frames, it's going to be the same result here. And now I can pull that box in one clean axis to extrapolate the arm motion. The axis that you choose will have different effects based on the parent motion and the angle of that given controller. Turn on keep offset and resnap. Next up is the look at constraint from the upper arm to the cube. Select the arm, add constraint, look at. Oh, there we go. Select the arm, add constraint, eyedropper the cube. And then what's nice about reusing this cube that I already used is it already has the curve set to cycle. I just have to go in and clear those stray frames, and I'm good to go. And I'll start by offsetting the location Z to get things moving. And I can't help but futz with that tangent, even though it's doing nothing. Okay. But this feels a little isolated, and I want more looseness in that arm. So I'm going to do a weird little trick where I'm going to copy that location Z into the Y. And now I'm going to have that same motion, but I have to like drag it up to get it back to the base pose. But now I have more stuff to play with, and I can try inverting that curve. I can try, different scale amounts. I can even move this curve however I want to get just a little bit more play in that in the body. And now I have some motion there. Once I'm happy with that, I'll bake it down and clear the constraint. Before this, the arm didn't have any rotation on it because I had just given it straight up and down. But now that the upper arm has rotations on it, the lower arm and the wrist have, technically, they are rotating through the world space. So now I can offset the rotations in world space on the lower arm and hand to loosen those up. I have to do this one part at a time because I'm using the world space and not a rotation constraint to the global controller, which would also work here, but that double key can be a bit of a pain to deal with, especially on a cycle. So it was actually kind of easier to just do them one at a time with the world space. Like the problem I ran into with the leg IKs, when I did the parent to world space trick before, I need to have keys on that control in order to achieve what I want. There was a bit of a bug when I recorded this, and I had to toggle from parent to world and back, but in the spaces section of the animation panel, you can actually just bake. That bake button is going to bake it directly to whatever space you pick. So you can just pick all frames and bake, and boom. Since this controls an elbow, I personally want to restrict the motion as much to one axis as possible, so I'll just do a quick check of which curve is going to be the one that I want. And I need to be careful at this stage and not edit anything else, because this is in world space, meaning if I were to move the body, it's going to rip it off the arm. Had I used the rotation constraint, I could freely edit the body at this point, but again, I was being a little lazy. Now I was just playing with some rotation offsets. I can even poke around and just kind of vibe out what it would be like if this curve, if I advance it, that means it's actually leading the motion as opposed to overlapping from it. But that looks weird, so I'm going to put it back. And once I'm happy with that, all I have to do is go to the first frame, because this is a space, just hit tab in the viewport, set it back to parent, and then clean up those little frames because of the offsetting. And then I can do this with the hand as well. Bake to world space in the panel, cycle the curves. Then I'm going to check out my curves to determine which one I want to play with and start offsetting. But this hand was like at an angle, and I have it in world space rotation, which means it's a pretty bad Euler situation. So I'm going to do this weird little trick that I'll do often, which is I just grab the controller and I move it and I watch my keys. And I can say, these two need to move up, that one needs to move down, to move it in the flop that I want. So I'll give it a quick play. And then I can take advantage of how that multi-select tool is actually going to scale each curve independently. And I identified the X and the Y needed to be moved in unison, so I can just scale them together and then just keep playing with things until I have a nice little motion. And all of this I know mathematically is based on the motion of the upper arm, which is based on the motion of the up and down of the body and the wing and all that stuff. So I get to just have fun and just kind of decide how much I want. So the next and last level of this that I'll talk about today is chaining multiple lookats together. The setup takes a bit more work in Unreal, and hopefully I or someone can make a tool to do this for us, but it opens up some really cool ways to be able to edit and pose and create motion. The simple example I have for you is getting the head moving around by doing a lookat setup on the 3-neck controller simultaneously. You'll see that I can easily loosen things up and have a lot of control over the final motion. I'm going to use these 3 controllers along the neck. It's going to require a cube for each controller, and because of that, I want to name things nicely so I know which one is which. And I'll start by loading up that controller as the parent, and the cube in there. And I'll run the snapper with no offset. And I'm going to pull it out in space. Turn on, keep offset. Same stuff you've been seeing me do this whole time. It's like one trick, but in different ways, get you different results. And nothing's happened here, right? I've just done there's no constraint. I've just copied that motion out into space. And I'll jump ahead and I did that also on the 2 other controllers, and I have a neck mid and neck end cube. And you can see they're all just moving in unison with the controller that they were based on. And then now I'll connect things up with constraints. A pro tip is that you want to select the controller first, then frame up on the cube before clicking the constraint button, because it can actually be pretty hard to eyedropper sometimes, and when you tumble in the viewport, it'll cause the eyedropper to exit. Hopefully soon we can have a better system that is kind of like the snapper where you can just load stuff in, but we're not there. And you can also write those tools on your own. I know Blur did that in their demo the other day. So then I'm going to do that for the other controllers. Select the controller, frame up on the cube, eyedropper. Super exciting stuff, and boom, nothing's different. That's because I haven't done any offsets yet. This is the same motion, but now it's being generated by lookat constraints out in space, but it looks exactly the same. But the moment I play with these cubes, you can start to see how cool this is. Because of the magic of like a lookat constraint, each cube is looking at the rotation, or it's aiming at that cube, but it's staying in translation space with the rig. So to loosen things up, it'll be the same process as everything else. Grab the curves, click, click, click to cycle them, and then now we'll start by delaying the up and down on the controls. I'll offset them all from the body to start with, and then I'll offset them from each other so that the mid is offset more than the base, and the end is offset more than the mid. It's kind of subtle because he has a short little neck, but there is a simple whip going through the neck into the head. And while this effect isn't huge, you can see it clearly when I start to scale these curves. And what's really cool about doing this over a normal FK chain trick is that you can start to get really subtle and controlled with each part of the chain. So if I scale down that neck and cube more than the rest, I can actually stabilize and lock down that head while being able to still amplify the neck mid and the base. I can keep playing with the offsets of these things. I can even play with the body more. And I know that because that cube is now stabilized, that head is always going to be stabilized. Then I get to do this with the side to side. Grab the curves for all three of these, scale them up a bit so we can see the effect, offset them from the body, and then going to cascade those down the chain. And you'll see here, I keep doing this trick. I never actually do the big drag select. I just do a little vertical drag select over an empty part of a curve. This works in most programs, and I don't think most people know it. If you do that and you don't pick up any key, it's just going to select all the keys on that curve, which is a huge time saver. And it makes me sad when I see people zoom out to grab all the keys. So my final tangent is that the look at constraint is actually only constraining 2 rotation axes on your controller, leaving that twist axis alone. So if you want, you can actually add a rotation constraint on top of these 2. And with those stacked, the rotation constraint is only going to be grabbing that twist axis. So then with this box, I can play with the twist of it in addition to the translations and really get some offsets and some subtle flopping in the head. I'm going to fast forward through me playing with things and fine tuning, just taking full advantage of how much freedom and control I have with this step. And again, I could go back and edit the body stuff right now because this is all live. And I often will just leave this in my scene because I'm going to come back and I'm going to probably noodle on this and tweak on this a little bit more. And this just maintains the goal of my animation the whole time. But because it's a demo, I'll be clean and I'll bake down these constraints, which you can do all at once. Just select all the controls, bake, and they're gone. And then after repeating this process for the remaining controls, here's the final result. I've obviously edited things down for time, but start to finish, my raw recordings were about 2 hours to go from that wing flap to this final animation. And anytime that I did a space switch or a bake or something like that, I didn't edit that. It's that fast. This is all very procedural-ish, but you're there as the artist the whole way through, partnering with the computer, letting it do the computer-y stuff while you make all the decisions. So hopefully some of that made sense, and if I'm lucky, it was a little bit reassuring, maybe inspiring about how easy animation in the engine can be. And with the team that we have, it's just going to be getting better and better. I think we have a few minutes left, so if anyone has questions, we can do a Q&A. Otherwise, thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.